Hey, everyone. I appreciate you dropping in and listening today. The questions, the thoughts, the response emails, the DMs, they're all phenomenal. If you could do me a favor and hit that sub button on your podcast player, or if you're watching this on YouTube, it would be huge. Welcome to the Intrusions in Depth podcast. I'm Josh Depp. I cut a considerable amount of thoughts on the broader landscape of variables that I use when building my mental model of sorts when discussing generative AI from the previous episode. And this episode is admittedly a little more loose, as I'm using bullet points to drive this companion piece. The TLDR on all of this is that we're still early, and honestly, there's a lot of hype right now. NVIDIA is probably the only company making money from this gold rush at this time. And not to mention anyone building data centers, I guess, could be lumped in there. At least real money that can be tied to the technology. Sure, there's some other metrics that we could use, government GDP, employment, productivity numbers, but all of those kind of have their own problems. As Elon Musk pointed out with using GDP, if you fire everyone at a Tesla factory and then hire them tomorrow at the DMV, the GDP would be great. But are we really that more productive? It was something like that. I think you get the point. However, we are starting to see some more promising use cases. And like I discussed in the last episode, a ton of fear marketing and fear mongering. And as I discussed in this episode, rage toward people who adopt this technology. I frequent some creative communities around the internet, and the hatred for people who use AI is astonishing sometimes. But there's a weird, pompous, self-righteous vibe from people who spend thousands of dollars to go into debt to be like an unpublished author or another CalArt style illustrator. That all seems unwarranted. I mean, I don't think it's quite the flex you think it is to praise how you've never used AI. You don't see lumberjacks flexing that, hey, I've never used a chainsaw because I like axes. And does it lower the bar to entry for artistic works? Yes. But let's go deeper into this whole thought exercise. For a book publisher, does it stop them from using human-created covers? No. What about a self-published author? No. For anyone else who could afford a cover, does it stop them? No. You're still allowed to pay people to do work. But for those individuals on a shoestring budget, does it give them an alternative? Yeah. Now, if you don't like something, don't buy the book. But making personal attacks on people is silly. And because they solved a problem a different way. Plus, I have a suspicion that even the professional artists, at least a small number of them, are using AI in some form or fashion. Maybe this isn't anything new. I know that when photography took off, there was something similar from the painters. As a personal preference, I look around my house and the only art I have is all painted. And the only photos in my house are of my family, some professionally taken, but most were taken by my wife with her iPhone. But I guess that's been around forever. As the rise of self-publishing took off, there were no literary gatekeepers. Or artists could find an audience via Instagram or YouTube, so the need for those institutions erodes. Sure, crap gets through and you get flooded with junk. Sure feels that way with AI slop sometimes on the internet. I'll be the first to admit that. However, I think it's a fear driven out of jealousy. And just a caveat, I feel that the training data argument is kind of weak. Now, straight up using IP, like the Stormtrooper vlogs, I could see being an issue. And for the record, I think those things are hilarious. I liked watching them. But I could see why Disney wouldn't be a fan, unless they could make $1 off of everyone that watches it or something. But that's a touchy subject, and I think it gets sorted out in due time by the courts. And spoiler alert, I think it's going to favor the big corporations in most cases. And I'm not sure copyright is as strong as people claim. Plus, copyright has been abused for a long time, way before these models existed. There's plenty of horror stories online of major studios asking people to option their book only to change the sex of the main character and some names, then produce a different movie shutting out the original author they ripped the plot from. And I even see this online talking about major studios asking these AI filmmaker artist people to come in, and all they want are their prompts in JSON and how they do their process. They're not looking to actually pay them. Then at that point, you're paying legal fees against a well-funded enemy. Anyway, all of this is to say that generative AI, this agentic world we are entering, is different. And this episode is going to jump around a bit as I plan to highlight some key points to accompany my previous episode. But first, let's not get sued. We're going to need it here.
The information presented in this show is sourced from publicly available materials and does not contain any classified or proprietary content. The views and opinions expressed are those of the host and guests alone and do not reflect the official policy or position of their employers or any affiliated organizations. Enjoy the show.
All right, as much as it pains me to say this, I'm going to simplify some specifics and use the term AI going forward. I don't want to dive into lower level concepts when trying to discuss higher level ideas. We don't need to see how everything works to understand these ideas. Think of it like I'm talking in C++ or even Python. You don't need to know the assembly or what's going on in the compiler or what's coming out of the interpreter to understand this at a high level. If you see the words print hello screen on the terminal, you can probably guess what I'm trying to get at here. And if that doesn't make sense to you, I know not everyone who listens to the show is a hardcore computer person. Think of it like I want to tell you a story. You get the concept of a story, and you're capable of listening without me first asking you to turn your head so that I can move air in the form of sound waves to enter your ears that are then processed through vibrations in your skull and then interpret those signals by your brain as a series of events from my imagination. Instead of saying all of that, you can just say, hey, I want to tell you a story. And you turn your head and start listening. The point here is to think about the broader implications. And as I explore things on a macro level, undoubtedly, some of you will disagree with the points I'm making here. That's awesome. I want to hear it. But to get started, as a core model to use to think about how these transformer-based token generators are used, it's helpful to think of them as using math to predict the next character based on previous information. Maybe thinking of it as a really complex spell checker, even though that's kind of a simplified version. But going down to some crazy decimal point to predict the next token with a high level of accuracy. Undoubtedly, it's a technological change that will impact many sectors worldwide. I think there could be some big changes to science, especially around synthetic biology and DNA sequencing. Could also further change the landscape of war, right? When the world is a bastion of peace and happiness is abundant right now. There's no turmoil or anything going on. Now, some politicians and leaders are banking on it as a way to grow themselves out of debt. I have doubts on that front. I'm not an economics expert by any means of the imagination, but there's a ton of downward pressure on that happening in the West. First, we don't have the energy needed to run these data centers to power these models at scale. China is going to be brought up multiple times as a comparison, but I think they're the only player in this space worth talking about, besides the United States. As it looks right now, every other nation not named China or the United States will probably be some sort of vessel state when it comes to AI adoption or model use. Essentially, you're either going to use US models or Chinese models. And looking at the power generation of China, the EU, and the United States in 2024, China's output that year was 10,073 terawatt hours, while the EU was at 2,732 terawatt hours, and the United States was at 4,378. And for context, in 2023, the US was at 4,250 terawatt hours. So in a year, with LLMs going ham, we only squeezed out 128 more terawatt hours. That's not very impressive. And there's a myriad of things kind of pushing against that, mostly in the form of regulation and how hard it is to get power generation online. So China is by far the world's largest producer. Granted, it probably sucks to be a citizen there as they're using the social credit score to will you into compliance while poisoning the environment. But arguably, they're in a better place to be able to scale quote-unquote AI use. And just to reiterate, China's 2024 output alone exceeded the combined generation of the US and EU. And due to regulations on the EU and US, as well as the previous actions like demoing nuclear sites as a symbolic sacrifice to the altar of Greta Thunberg, neither is in a position to ramp up production. There's also tons of leftover environmental regulations getting in the way. And I don't want to open that climate change can of worms, but some of the science driving those decisions are weak at best. We're going to talk about that a little later. Second, the United States and, well, every Western country in some fashion has a bit of a spending problem. The number of government workers, non-productive citizens, overseas funding campaigns of conflicts, and rising cost of life due to inflation, as well as like fraud and stuff. Well, the government involvement tends to wipe out the gains and force a sort of monopoly in some ways, especially those seen as strategic to the government. It's a very Chinese model in some ways. You see a ton of competition until a leader emerges, and then they get government backing. Speaking in simplified terms, if you spend $5 for every $3 that you make, you're never going to balance the budget. Inflation, or I guess the rebranded name, affordability, only compounds this by making the $3 worth less, and then turning the ratio into spending $6 or $7 instead of the $3. The overall number keeps getting bigger, thus spending keeps ballooning even as the increased tax receipts come in, until something limits those tax receipts, which is probably some sort of heavy-handed regulation intended to force a monopoly. Or enough people figure out the loopholes and the others just go broke, and you can't tax broke people, they don't have money. Third, there's a cultural element of AI adoption that is countering all of this. The artist, book publisher, photography examples from earlier could be considered here. And this could be expanded out to a cultural element in general. One of which that could creep to fill this entire episode. And I'm going to be honest, this is the aspect of AI that I'm most terrified about. The fostering of the feedback loop where more government involvement is voted in. The problem gets worse, and then more involvement is needed. Downstream of that is more corruption, terrible outcomes, and high burdens put on citizens. And on the other side of all of that is the sort of societal promises made to young people. Younger people who have had enough. They've been lied to. They've been pressure cooked by life. And then they just start to chimp out. Especially many people who see AI adoption as a way to take them out of the job market or squeeze them for yet more productivity in favor of more stagnant wages. For junior level people entering the workforce, I think this first point is valid. Going back to the attack in the previous episode, the impressive part was that the AI was able to utilize scale and the attacker's output and automate the grunt work. Now, it wasn't perfect. It messed up credentials by hallucinating. It got excited over nothing burgers, and overall it made some mistakes along the way. As a manager and a prior NCO myself and someone who leads teams of junior employees, mentors new people, etc., this is stuff that I expect from individuals early in their career or new to their role. Not out of them being malicious or anything else, it's just they don't know any better. And I limit the amount of information or critical task until I can trust their output. Ironically, if I'm using an LLM to send a reply to an email or clean up my notes, I generally trust the output. Now, if I was asking it whether I had cancer based on a dream from last night, I might question things a little more. Others in this stage of their career probably expect similar. I'm not some special unicorn or anything like that. Where the efficiency gains are seen is that with someone that's highly capable, they can scale their tedious task at a lower price point than having to pay someone else. That's the pitch for all of these AI startups. This represents a change in how we need to think as a society and how we approach education systems. Now, does this mean giving free college to everyone? No, that's kind of worked out terribly, actually. An entire generation, my generation, has been told that if you get a college degree, you'll have a guaranteed job in the middle class and be able to afford a lifestyle your parents had, or even better. All because you have this piece of paper that says university on it. And it turns out that inflation, greed, and addiction to taxpayer money proved all of that to be a very expensive lie, and many are turning to socialism for the comfort and safety that they were promised, and sometimes resorting to violence when those promises weren't met. But the colleges who sold them this lie and that useless degree get a lot more administrators, and they get a bigger endowment. And as someone who got the opportunity to serve in the military and complete both my degrees while on active duty, Those long nights, early mornings for years influenced my decisions on this matter, but I've come around to thinking that some sort of college forgiveness is probably warranted. I think the United States, or the world for that matter, is a much better place if there's less losers in life. It's tough because I think if you do forgive the student loans, that's a reward for bad behavior in place. However, not doing so keeps downward pressure on individuals that we all need to prosper. I haven't thought about this too deeply, and I'm kind of just going off the cuff here. And while I guess I'm thinking about it at the top of my mind, the system probably needs to be overhauled where the schools need to underwrite their admission choices and degree offerings. I also think the government grants for science should be given out in like a lottery, but that's way outside the scope of all this episode. I think there's plenty of well-meaning individuals at these institutions really trying to help the children and young adults they're trying to educate. But there's probably some bad apples in there too. I think there is a purpose for college and governments, etc., but I think there needs to be a function where they're rewarded for the outcomes promised, in this case, more educated, capable graduates, and punished for the outcomes we don't want. Baristas with useless degrees and $200K in debt. This is always going to happen in some degree, but I think there could be better safeguards in place. And I'm getting away from the point, and I'm just a podcaster in some makeshift sound studio. And like most things, history has a case study to draw upon, though, here. Around the turn of the century, the 20th century, in Russia, the intelligentsia emerged as a distinct social group of educated individuals, often from like lower backgrounds, the non-nobles. These people were critical of the Tsarist regime, the autocracy there. Now, they were typically university educated in fields like law, philosophy, or literature, but they were excluded from like the real power or the economic security due to Russia's rigid class structure and really just a lack of a middle class. Now, this quote-unquote status inconsistency, these are air quotes here, was that there were high cultural capital but low socioeconomic standing people, and this drove people towards radical ideologies. What it boiled down to was that they believed that they deserved the higher status of society than they currently had because they believed themselves to be highly educated and the most knowledgeable amongst their society. And these are leaders like Lenin, who was a lawyer by training, and Trotsky, who was a journalist and intellectual. They all echoed this. The Bolsheviks party drew heavily from the intelligentsia, people who saw violent overthrow as necessary for progress. But as this went on, the revolution divided the intelligentsia. Now, some supported it as a path of equality and freedom, while others, usually dubbed reactionaries, fled it or they opposed it. And the mob always eats itself when it runs out of enemies. The October Revolution, which was in 1917, when the Bolshevik-led takeover that overthrew the government succeeded, it was partially because the intellectuals mobilized workers and peasants. But it also led to a civil war and state violence under the Soviets. So that's awesome, because as you can probably imagine, that civil war and state violence is very conducive to prosperity and people just being happy and singing Kumbaya. I'm kidding, it's pretty much the opposite. And without the Bolsheviks' intervention, some argue a more gradual liberal reform might have fostered a middle-class society instead. Now, obviously, that's some Monday morning quarterbacking. And for anyone considering like, hey, this doesn't sound half bad. Well, the Soviet Union went on to have high rates of corruption, famine, death, and suffering, as well as terrible living conditions for most of the citizens, but a select few. And as George Carlin said, you're probably not in that club. I mean, you can even fast forward to all of this too and just see how it ended. Check out the suicide rates and the levels of alcoholism in the 90s when the USSR fell. Now, this Russian pattern highlights how educated outsiders, alienated from like the emerging bourgeoisie, viewed violence not as like chaos, but as a progressive force to kind of dismantle oppression, something that we should try not to repeat here. However, post-revolution, many of these same intellectuals, they struggled to adapt to the new regime. And with most of the high-profile ones, they were actually prosecuted under Stalin. And it turns out they were used to gain power for other power-hungry narcissists. All of this is to add context to my original point of pressure slowing down adoption due to like cultural changes. or even tearing society apart before the gains can even be realized. The AI marketing department hasn't really been helping with selling the upsides either. It's all job losses and replacing people and robot cars. The solution is probably overhauling universities to be more reflective of on-the-ground work centers, or possibly tax incentives for companies to provide internships or skills training. And just as someone that works with universities quite often, I'm really impressed by the number of universities that are trying to adopt new ways that are reflective of what their graduates will see when they enter the job market. It's really awesome. I'm glad to see this is happening. And I think making the data center owners build their own power is a good idea. Maybe you could expand that to them providing solar to other communities to take them off the grid and increasing the amount of capacity that they introduce to the grid. Maybe it's time for some real leadership from these tech companies, taking some of their huge cash reserves sitting on their books and investing it back into society. This is what Carnegie and Rockefeller did. Changed the perception of greedy capitalist tech bros to being a true philanthropist for the citizen of your home nation. Stuff that lowers the cost of living for people and shows the benefit of AI and adopting technology. The crux of this problem is that in order for you to have high-skilled humans, they have to have a path there. The first problem is being a low-skilled junior employee with a drive to be high-skilled. Unfortunately, some want the rewards of being highly skilled with the responsibilities and expected outcomes of being low-skilled. It's a bit of a cultural problem of sorts. Everyone has heard the Uncle Ben quote from Spider-Man, "With great power comes great responsibility." But I like the way Seth Godin framed it instead. With great responsibility comes great power. Okay, I think I have sufficiently hammered this point, so let's change gears now. There's another faction of people who want AI adoption and technological progress to decrease or stop. Now, ironically, some of these individuals made fortunes from tech companies. But the idea is to not adopt technologies like AI to preserve the environment or people's jobs. The cultural society issue I just kind of talked about. The problem with this is that it mimics the same sentiments when it comes to like climate change advocates arguing the same thing. This playbook has been used before. But I think the climate change is the easiest way for people to wrap their head around it. Many of them taking private jets to conferences around the world or living on the coast despite them urging others not to do so because of flooding. And I'm not saying climate change isn't real and that people don't deserve a clean environment. Far from all of that. I just need something global as an example that many people can latch onto. The issue is that those views lack a global context, though. Other players in the world have a say, which is a hard concept or worldview for people under 45 to grasp. After Desert Storm, everyone in the United States and NATO countries assumed that their military is so advanced and strong, they can kind of do whatever they want. That's kind of been the U.S. foreign policy for a while. But then there's been considerable constant effort by other superpowers to catch up. And other countries are starting to push back by flexing their own sovereignty back. And this is all hard to realize at a global scale when you have local issues, but it's one that needs to be accounted for. There's a game theory or kind of a lack of understanding about the dynamics as such that come into play. Okay, I've been playing around with a new way to solicit for call to actions from my viewers, and, well, you'll get the point.
We got it from here.
Saddle up, partner, it's time to ride. Hit the subscribe button with podcast pride. We're clean raining all across the land. Join our posse, going to help the man. Round them up, likes and shares. Show your friends that someone cares. Ring that bell so you never miss each episode. Podcast Bliss. Yeehaw, we're wrangling quits today in the most tilted way. Oh, bots are seen to you and me. Build this community, step to that part. Hit subscribe, join our rowdy podcast tribe. Leave a review, 5 stars would be great. Help us wrangle at a faster rate.
Game theory is a branch of mathematics and economics that studies strategic decision-making in situations where the outcomes for each participant, or if you look at the books written on it, they're often called players, but where these outcomes depend on the choices of all of those involved. It models conflicts and cooperation between rational agents, assuming they aim to maximize their own payoffs. Now, obviously, rational is a subjective term, but I think we all get the point here. Once again, in these books, they're called benefits or utilities, and this is all developed by John von Neumann and John Nash. It's applied in fields like economics, political science, biology, computer science, and even philosophy to analyze scenarios ranging from business negotiations to evolutionary biology. And in this case, we're going to apply it specifically to artificial intelligence and geopolitics and a sort of cybersecurity defensive playbook. Now, one of the concepts often described in game theory is prisoner's dilemma. You've probably heard of this before. Well, the theory is that each prisoner thinks like this in some sort of way. If the other guy stays silent, then the best thing for me to do is to rat him out. I'll go free instead of getting 1 year. But if the other guy rats me out, then I still have to rat him out. Otherwise, I get 10 years instead of 5. So no matter what the other person does, confessing or ratting is always the personally safer choice. And this is the definition of like a Nash equilibrium. A situation essentially where no player can do better by changing their strategy alone, assuming everyone else's strategy stays the same. Now, both confessing is the only stable outcome because whoever tries to unilaterally switch to silence, they get screwed so much worse. Now, both staying silent would be better for both. They would only get 1 year each or something or be set free, but it's not stable. And each has a strong incentive to cheat and go free. And we could go deeper and discuss like zero sum and non-zero sum concepts, but I think we all get the point here. But now let's apply this idea to like the global powers arm race. And this is a personal opinion or observation, just to be clear. It's not backed by anyone and no one's paid me to have these opinions. Overall, there's a lack of understanding that other people in other countries have a say in how this technology is adopted, how it's utilized. This is why laws or regulations on such technology needs to be evaluated with a goal rather than creating market capture scenario for whatever lobbyist slipped you a gold bar or bought your wife a Mercedes. Or for trying to control the narrative to the users. Simply saying, no killer robots can be used in defense because it feels too close to the Terminator franchise is a recipe for someone else eating your lunch. The reality of the situation in defense is actually a lot like it is in the business world right now. Other actors are going to use the technology. If you don't, there's a high likelihood that you're going to be left behind. Even if you put a killer robot to human casualty rate to 2-to-1, you lose 2 robots for every 1 casualty in a hot war. If you can maintain that manufacturing base, the attrition is going to catch up. Then economics of scale start taking place. It's probably faster to build a robot with 110 IQ than to grow a human, fighting age person with an IQ of 120 or 125. Plus, you can make the robots way harder to kill. Not to mention, in some aspects, the time needed to keep a human in the loop is going to be too large of a window to react effectively. Let's think about this from like the Anthropic report. Let's assume that the Claude bots are better. By the time those exploits hit an edge device, they pwn the network and steal everything. Your SOC still may be sleeping. Your tier 1 analysts might still be looking at the first alert in the chain. You could expand this application to many scenarios. Navy ships reacting to possible hypersonic missiles, even nuclear weapons. So sure, you can make the personal choice of not buying or consuming items made with generative AI or not supporting companies that use it. But ultimately, I have a harsh reality for you. The universe doesn't care. And this is rampant right now. Let's jump back to the creatives again. On X in December of 2025, animators and artists are up in arms about Disney signing a massive billion-dollar deal with OpenAI. Spoiler alert, knowing how good of a deal maker Sam Altman is, I would imagine there are talks with Netflix, Warner Brothers, Amazon, and numerous other animation studios as well. And for some reason, these creatives thought massive companies would consider their feelings on the pursuit of making money and buying yachts. Grow up. Millions of other people with jobs and active subscriptions will continue to watch the content when it's good enough. Now back to the geopolitics on this situation. regulating yourself out of generative AI on some moral high ground isn't going to stop the others from going all in to replace you on the world stage, or at the very least, improve their world standing. So simply banning the use of AI for offensive action or automated defense isn't the answer here. The world has made this decision for you. They have proven too beneficial to continue not to at least go forward. Could there be some sort of bubble here? Absolutely. Could there be concerns about over-leveraging on the outputs? Absolutely. Are there potentials for mistakes? You bet. Could they be used to propagandize and dumb down populations? Of course. But unfortunately, those are all issues that can come from humans too. So if you are even marginally better than the humans, many would argue that's a step in the right direction. And I get it. This is coming from a caveman who would rather drive my own car instead of relying on self-driving, even when I know it's good enough or proven to be safer. If I'm going to crash and potentially die, I want it to be on me. And all of this could be a tone point and out of scope for the purposes here, but I think you all get it by now. Even as I talk to people getting into cybersecurity or those that have been in the trenches for a while, the use of LLMs pops up as it is 2026. And unfortunately, my response is one of brutal realism. This is the world we live in now. Indirect prompt injection, filtering prompts, and trying to think of all the permutations of how someone would abuse them is difficult, and it feels like a dumb way of doing things. I mean, I feel like every conference I go to, someone's honing the crap out of Copilot. Now, code and text are going to be in the same box. Good luck on that input validation. Yes, it might say stuff you don't want it to. It might even lie to you. However, for most organizations, it's either actual or perceived to be beneficial to leverage the technology to maximize returns for their shareholders. So you learn more about the tech, you leverage the tech, or you get replaced by someone who has. It's brutal. It's not all rainbows and unicorns, but in all of this, you have to access the conditions on the field rather than how you feel about something. And that, folks, is your New Year's motivational message for 2026. I went back and forth on adding this section to this episode. One, I feel like this episode was getting too negative and doom and gloom, and no one needs that energy right now. And two, I like Anthropic's products a lot. I think the Claude models are really good at what they do, but wish they were a little loose with censorship, kind of like xAI's Grok. And Anthropic is a well-run company competing with giants, X and OpenAI, and the inertia created by being with Elon Musk and that type of talent only appears to be able to attract more talent. And Google is rich, and they can compete in any market they go after. Plus, they were very early on this hardware boom for machine learning and AI with their TPUs, their tensor processing units. Plus, they have a knowledge to build and scale and run data centers. I would argue that the goal of modern AI data centers is a little different, but they definitely have some tribal knowledge there. But I guess in some ways, it's a bit of a misnomer, as Anthropic was created by OpenAI executives going their own way in 2021. So as I discuss these next points, I'm going to do my best to remain balanced and just present points. Anthropic bills itself as like an AI safety-based company. It has an idea or a concept of a constitutional AI with an emphasis on training models with ethical principles from world documents like the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Now, the UN Human Rights Council obviously has its issues, like including Iran and Cuba on it, but it's probably a good starting point. The stated go-to-market strategy for Anthropic is that by having a safe and ethical set of models, they are better positioned to be in corporate environments and academia. The concern is that these quote-unquote ethical models will influence regulations and policy toward views and an ideology that aligns with Anthropic's worldview. Now, is that a problem? Possibly not. Not every culture, organization, government, nation, etc., they may not share those same values, though. Shouldn't this be something that's voted on in some form or fashion? As in, if you're in a republic or democratically? Oh, and no one votes for Anthropic in this role. Just if you were wondering, just somebody decides it's a good idea and they push it through procurement. And as I hinted at in the earlier episode, Anthropic also has a tendency to fear market or fearmonger the dangers of AI. Now, skeptics argue Anthropic's emphasis on AI dangers amount to fear mongering for regulatory advantage. And this is primarily voiced by people like White House AI czar David Sachs, who accused Anthropic's strategy as a sophisticated regulatory capture strategy. There's also other issues that I think all of the models are guilty of, including using copyright the data to train their models. Now, many people, full disclosure, myself included, are weary of Anthropic's effective altruism ties. Besides some of the sketchy individuals associated with the philosophy, Sam Bankman-Fried being one of them, some supporters advocate for eugenics, and effective altruism, EA, can leave a bad taste or like a weird feeling to some. Now, my chief complaint with the movement is that the long-term predictions they are using are not viewed as science fiction, but as some sort of like Nostradamus-like prediction. Especially when the data points driving these predictions are terrible. Now, one flawed data point can impact a lot of people if the storytellers presenting the data are compelling enough. I'm not saying these people were EA supporters, but I think this highlights this example as well. And once again, I'm not taking a position on climate change here, just presenting a data point to consider. You're all adults here. Think for yourselves. But in the journal Nature, in April 17, 2024, a paper appeared called, quote, "The Economic Commitment of Climate Change." And the paper looked at how changes in temperature and precipitation could affect economic growth. Now, the paper was the source of many headlines because the authors predicted that climate change would cost $38 trillion a year by the year 2049. Now, 38 trillion is a big number, and it was obviously in magazines like Forbes and countless newspapers. And the paper has been accessed over 3,000 times. It's been cited 168 times, according to the Clarivate's Web of Science, and not to mention the number of YouTube channels, TikToks, LinkedIn posts, blogs, etc., that are all downstream generating content based off that headline. Well, at the end of 2025, the paper was retracted. This means that the error was so egregious that it couldn't be corrected. It had to be removed entirely. So you may be asking, which data point was flawed and by how much? Well, the results were highly sensitive to an inclusion of data from one country, Uzbekistan. Which seems odd that we use data from one country to drive world policy, one country that most people couldn't find on a map, even if you put labels on it. Now, going deeper, there were inaccuracies in the underlying economic data for Uzbekistan, especially during the period from 1995 to 1999. And this is one of the criticisms of like the Blue Zone diet stuff as well. Those records indicating longevity, they could be doctored because the governments don't track data correctly. That's a shocker. So there could be things in the area like world wars skewing things. So people may have an incentive to live longer on paper, like getting retirement funds, or people's kids assuming their identities to keep up those retirement funds. Now, this data appears to be flawed from the start. Now, the first retraction was in July of 2024, 2 months after the paper was released, where the tables were wrongly printed as a decimal point instead of a percentage point. Whoops. I guess it's a good thing the actual scientists went back and checked their work rather than blindly accepting it, right? I personally assume that this was the reason for pre-publication and peer reviewing. Now, quoting retractionwatch.com, I'll link through to this article, but they're a good follow. They have a good newsletter too, and I recommend them. Quote, "The authors of the Matters Arising commentary published August 6 note that the article projected the global gross domestic product would be lowered by 62% by 2100, an impact roughly 3 times larger than similar estimates. The authors of the critique also pointed out that the PIK authors had used a dataset for Uzbekistan with anomalies. By removing the Uzbek data, the estimate in the original paper aligns closely with previous literature," the critique reads, end quote. So basically, this was one new report that didn't align with a whole bunch of other documented research. And that skewed the results so much that when they removed it, it gave a more reflective and more predictive answer, which has sort of been a problem in science altogether, the inability to recreate outcomes of studies. Anyway, There were also implications from this paper that don't make sense logically that drew criticism from other experts. Like, wouldn't warmer climates across colder areas like Canada and Russia be better for growing food? These are huge cold land masses after all. Wouldn't more favorable weather be better for animals and crops and people? Also, plants like CO2. Wouldn't more of it yield better crops? Wouldn't that slow down the world hunger? What about new shipping lanes across the north? Wouldn't that lower fuel cost? Would coast degrading be offset by more land being available in places like Siberia? I don't know the answers to all of this, and this is all just stuff that I found while doing research, but it feels like some foundational knowledge was overlooked in some of these assessments. And this is the problem with long-termism views. You're being asked to ignore data points in favor of emergent data. And I'm not a psychologist or anything like that, but humans have a tendency to bias new over old, which I'm not quite sure is always right. But back to my point here, this long-termism is something that effective altruism people, they support and they love to do. And they use it to influence their narrative. And this is why it gives me pause to see any association with the movement. There's just too many variables to consider if you expand the time scale out ultimately. I personally doubt predictions of what the year 2030 will hold, and I would encourage you to be skeptical of anyone claiming to know with certainty. Are they taking into consideration black swan events? And on the matter of Anthropic and EA, out of an abundance of caution, I want to make clear and precise with my wording. Ultimately, it boils down to like a feels kind of vibe, rather than something supported by hard fact. Anthropic's founders have had some history with the movement, but I don't know their current views or anything else. I can only surmise that based off recent interviews, which I'm about to do. But all of this is ultimately why I even considered scrapping all of this altogether. I pulled my notes from the first episode because I felt like it didn't fit. And I know it pops up quite a bit online with Anthropic and felt that it probably made sense to cover it here. Now, some of you would probably be wondering why I didn't cover it, while others would be oblivious to the movement. And if you think some of this is unfair towards the movement, that's cool too. There's a lot of stuff that I don't get or I don't trust that people do, and I ain't got nothing but love for you. Good luck, Merry Christmas, Happy Kwanzaa, whatever. I'm looking at you, meme coins, and people who expose their firewall interfaces to the internet, for example. I wanted to provide some actual counterpoints to some of these long-termism views and actual claims made by the founder of Anthropic, Dario Amodei. Now, right off the bat, I really appreciate the breadth of knowledge and the ability of the team to sit and discuss these points of views for 5 hours and then release it for free on the internet. It's really encouraging to see this many views on a 5-hour podcast, and that these busy individuals see the utility in taking their time to explain all of this. It's a great time to be alive. However, in researching this episode, I've taken some notes from the podcast to highlight some of the long-termism concerns and some counters to this. I don't claim to be as smart as these individuals, and please comment below where you think I could do better. And I understand that I'm kind of cherry picking some things here, and it could be taken out of context. I've done my best to avoid that. Now, claim 1, catastrophic misuse is a top risk because AI breaks the historical protective correlation between high intelligence or education and low willingness to do evil. Here's the quote. Humanity has been protected by the fact that the overlap between really smart, well-educated people and people who want to do really horrific things has generally been small. Why would such a person risk their life, risk their legacy, their reputation to do something truly, truly evil? My worry is that by being a much more intelligent agent, AI could break that correlation. End quote. In my eyes, this assumes that the main barrier to catastrophic attacks has always been like a lack of expertise rather than other factors, logistics, funding, detection, motivation, or countermeasures, or even lumping in religious or cultural objections. And this is an example of using one data point while ignoring the others. History shows that many catastrophic or near catastrophic attacks were carried out by people with moderate technical skill, the 9/11 attackers, the Cherokee sarin attack, or numerous other cyber attacks carried out by script kiddies or state-sponsored groups using off-the-shelf tools. The bottleneck is rarely like raw scientific knowledge on how to do something. Now, open information has already drastically lowered these barriers. The vast majority of dangerous biological or nuclear knowledge is available in open literature or on the internet. A declassified 1970s Progressive magazine article on the hydrogen bomb design, for example. And there's numerous synthetic biology protocols all over PubMed and GitHub. Yet, we have not seen any proliferation of successful non-state sea burning attacks, for example. This suggests that defenses, monitoring, and attribution are somewhat effective barriers than just kind of lack of knowledge. Or maybe there are easier tools to inflict harm. Guns, trucks, TikTok. AI could equally enhance defensive capabilities. Expert-led AI tools in the hands of defenders, like government, cybersecurity firms, biosecurity agencies, etc., they could detect, attribute, and neutralize threats faster than the attackers could exploit them. That's kind of the promise in putting AI in some of these defensive tools. Now, the net effect may be risk reduction rather than risk increasing, which is why I tend to lean towards the risk management frameworks instead of being strict from the start, which admittedly, living in a litigious environment like the United States could be a mistake. We're a society ran by lawyers, not engineers here. Now, the second claim is very similar to the paperclip problem from Nick Bostrom, another EA philosopher. The claim being that autonomy risks are serious because advanced models may pursue misaligned goals when given agency. The perfect control is hard after all. Here's a quote from the podcast. Models might, on their own, they're on a long enough leash. Are they really doing what we want them to do? It's very difficult to even understand in detail what they're doing, let alone control it. There's early signs that it's hard to perfectly draw the boundary. End quote. Now, I have a lot of sympathy for this position, as I do think it's hard to have this level of control in the model. However, as it appears, current and near future systems are tools. They're not really autonomous agents with persistent goals. Even when given agency, they still remain under human supervision and they can be interrupted or rolled back pretty easily. Now, this could easily change with killer robots, and we obviously can't roll back the harm that they could do if they kill a bunch of people. Now, true goal-pursuing autonomy requires persistent memory, independent resource access, and some self-modification capabilities that aren't quite there yet. Now, should we think about it? Sure. But let's not try to prevent it before we can do it. Now, empirical evidence shows that alignment improves with scale. It doesn't worsen. Now, larger models are generally more steerable and less likely to hallucinate dangerous content when properly prompted. And they're better at following instructions. The early signs that Dario mentions, annoying refusals or jailbreak vulnerabilities, they have decreased dramatically over the past 2 to 3 years. Through things like RLHF or reinforcement learning, human feedback, constitutional AI, and even old school filtering. I would also argue that there's other engineering disciplines that handle more dangerous systems without perfect control. Nuclear weapons, chemical plants, you could probably lump in the global financial systems too. They all have failure modes that could kill millions, yet we manage risks through layered defenses, redundancy, monitoring, kill switches, human oversight, rather than kind of halting the development. Maybe we think about safeguards prior to putting these models into dangerous systems. Claude and a Furby? Probably not a big deal. Claude and a trading bot reading PDFs from the internet? Good luck. Indirect prompt injection and straight up poisoning of the dataset through some SEO manipulation, and this could be rough. Then the next claim is that the responsibility scaling models, the RSP, with the ASL levels, is the right way to handle risk that are not here today, but coming fast. And all of this is to kind of use capability triggers based off of like if-then commitments, which I think is a kind of novel way of thinking about things, and I commend them for even coming there. Quote, how do you deal with something that's not here today, but is coming at us very fast? You need tests to tell you when the risk is getting close. So if the model passes a certain capability, then we impose a certain set of safety and security requirements. End quote. Now, this is another point that I have sympathy for and love that Anthropic is thinking about it. But I also think they tried to get some of this into law that was struck down by Gavin Newsom in California, but it got close. And this could influence how others solve the problem, not named Anthropic, and thus slow down frontier labs in the US, giving the edge to other places that don't follow those same laws. Or at the very least, you're adding a tax to US-based companies in the form of new rules to follow. And this could be like my libertarian leanings on the whole matter, but these thresholds, they're subjective and changeable and controlled solely by the company. Anthropic has already revised its RSPs many times. And the specific test for ASL3, my question is always, what counts as meaningfully enhancing a non-state sponsored Steve Bernie's attack? What does meaningfully enhancing means? These are not fully public or independently verified either. This creates a single point of failure. The company decides when to trigger these restrictions. Or they provide a report that says a terrorist group in Africa with high confidence that they named GTG-1003 showed evidence of using Claude to make VX gases, and they put it in a very weird configuration called a Perl configuration. And they planned to take over Alcatraz, and they were going to shoot rockets until their demands were met. But through their filters, they stopped the operation by contacting the government, and Dr. Stanley Goodspeed and SAS operative named John Patrick Mason saved the day. R.I.P. Sean Connery. But this boils down to being overly cautious, and maybe I'm wrong here, but if ASL3 triggers quote-unquote next year, as Dario suggests is plausible, it could impose heavy security and filtering requirements that slow medical, scientific, and economic processes for years, based on risks that remain hypothetical at best. Risks that the other competitors, they don't care about. More importantly, it centralizes power in a small number of labs. By tying safety to proprietary models and internal evaluations, it discourages open source development, which many argue accelerates both the safety and research. There's more eyes on the problem, and it could enhance the defensive capabilities as well. Then the skin in the game problem arises as well. There's no enforcement mechanisms behind self-commitment if a lab, Anthropic, or a competitor decides that these tests are too conservative or the risks are overstated. They can simply just ignore them or reinterpret the policy if they wanted to. And this is kind of jumping on both sides of the argument. This is not a robust governance mechanism either. There's no international treaties or independent regulator and oversight. And it all centralizes the power. The next claim is that ASL3 could revive very soon, possibly 2025. It didn't. And it's very likely to be as late as 2030. Quote, I would not be surprised at all if we hit ASL3 next year. That could still happen this year. It's very hard to say, but I would be very, very surprised if it was 2030. Now, in reality, recent evaluations, including Anthropic's own, show that current frontier models are still far from providing end-to-end dangerous assistance. For example, models often give incomplete, contradictory, or safety-aware responses when they're asked about sensitive topics, and red teaming exercises have not been coherent. There's no step-by-step plans, and they don't meaningfully shorten timelines for non-experts. As seen in this cyber attack in episode 1 of this series, progress in dangerous capabilities have been slower than feared. Dario even testified this in 2023 about serious biorisk within the next 2 to 3 years. Yet 2024 and 2025 evaluations still place the model well below the thresholds that would trigger ASL3 even under Anthropic's own definitions. Now, capability jumps are becoming less predictable and sometimes smaller than expected. This feels like an eternity ago now, but the leap from GPT-3 to GPT-4, OpenAI's models, was large. But other iterations have shown diminishing marginal returns, especially on some dangerous tasks, suggesting that ASL3 may arrive later than projected. And the last claim in the podcast was that for ASL4 and beyond, mechanical interpretability is needed because models may deceive or sandbag the evaluations. Here's a quote. They might sandbag tests, they might not tell the truth about tests. There's going to be an important component of using other things than just interacting with these models. Interpretability or hidden chains of thought, end quote. Now, this is a really interesting concept to think about and could be its own novel. I think the overall consensus is that deception and sandbagging in current models are brittle and easily detected with basic techniques, using multiple prompts, consistently checking, oversight by other models. Now, I'm fully aware that there are paper on quote-unquote sleeper agents, but these all require specific contrived training setups that do not reflect the standard training configurations. It requires enhanced knowledge to even get it to do so. It's more of a party trick instead of a reality. Is it useful research? Absolutely. But is it something we should care about right now? Probably not. And there are alternative approaches like strong oversight from multiple models checking each other, process supervision, debate, or even simple containment, running dangerous tasks in an air-gapped environment that may prove more practical and robust than wanting all these other breakthroughs that don't currently exist. These counterpoints do not dismiss the possibility of serious risk, but challenge the specific framing, the urgency, and the proposed solutions in the podcast and similar testimony, all from Anthropic's founder. My goal here isn't to dismiss any of this, just saying it's a bit more nuanced than using blunt force restrictions they seek to impose. There are second and third order effects that we need to consider. If we expect these models to make life better for everyone, then we can't restrict the uses and information too extreme. What if there's a new compound that could be used to treat cancer, but it looks too close to a chemical attack alternative? Because it targets specific cells, it modifies the T cells. Now, in the past, those seeking heavy regulation have done so to crowd out the little guys, the little players, and impose costs on them that they can't eat. Then they consolidate, and we have antitrust issues and monopolies. And I don't think this leads to the generational wealth promised by going all in on AI. And it doesn't help when AI views are trending towards negative with the general population anyway. Admittedly, this episode may be uncomfortable in some ways as I did venture outside the scope of the show, but wanted to give some of the other insights that I considered when thinking about how I crafted the first part of this episode. I don't want you to walk away from here thinking Anthropic's a shady company or anything like that. And I think that there's really massive research and progress being made there. I'm just very quick to say, please pump the brakes on accepting everything as gospel from someone that had skin in the game to convince you to do so. But other than that, I think I've made my points here. I'm interested to hear your feedback as well. And with that, I think this is a good place to end. I'm Josh Depp. Thanks for listening.
Crank